Archiving started.
All right, here we see from a cadaver view the eye. Of course, you see the muscles. In lab, we're naming some of these muscles. If you'll follow the arrows, the muscle that extends out towards the front of the eye, that's at the top, is called the superior rectus. At the side would be the lateral rectus, the inferior rectus, and then the medial rectus. You really can't see it on this view. I'll put an arrow, but it's on the medial, towards the medial surface of the eyeball. But the rectus muscles, as they contract, they make the eye go up and down and sideways. Okay. Also, we have superior and inferior oblique muscle. The superior oblique is way up there. All right, can you see that? And if you'll notice, its ligament comes onto the surface, or excuse me, that'd be a tendon coming onto the surface of the eye. All right, so it kind of curves around and then comes across the top of the eye. That would be the superior oblique, and then the inferior oblique is below it, and that allows our eyes to rotate just a little bit, the superior and the inferior oblique. All right, those are the all of the muscles of the eye that you need to be familiar with. All right, then on this next slide, we can see a sectioned view of the eye. At the front, you see the cornea, and then this structure would be the lens. If you look in between the cornea and the lens, you see the structure that everybody's familiar with, and that's the colored part of the eye called the iris. And remember, the opening inside, in the middle of the iris, would be the pupil, and that's where light waves enter. All right, I've erased the arrows. If you'll look beside the lens, above it and below it, it actually forms a ring all the way around it. That would be your ciliary body, and you can see the little suspensory ligaments that connect from the ciliary body to the lens. And so the action of the ciliary body determines whether the lens gets thick or thin, and that's determined by if you're looking at objects close up or far away. And in lecture, you're learning that that's the accommodation reflex. When you look at something up close, the lens gets thick, and then when you look at an object far away, the lens thins. You lose the ability for the lens to get thick as you get older, and so that's the reason that people, usually it's around age 40, that's why they need reading glasses. Okay, now some other features of the eye that you've seen on some of the other labeling exercises that you see from your lab book. If we looked at the back of the eye, you can see the different layers at the back. The white part, that would be the sclera, and that's made up of dense, regular, fibrous connective tissue. It comes around, it becomes continuous with the outer part of the nerve, the optic nerve. This is about the strongest tissue in the body. So you saw it in AMP1 when it makes up the ligaments and the tendons, but you also see it here in the eye as the sclera, S-C-L-E-R-A, sclera. And that forms most of the outer covering of the eye, except at the very front, where you see right here the cornea. Okay, now if I erase those arrows and look just inside the sclera, this dark layer, the little dark line that you see, that represents the choroid coat, and it's loaded with melanocytes, which of course produce pigments like melanin, which is a brown pigment that absorbs light. So as light comes into the back chamber of the eye, it's not going to bounce around because it's absorbed by the choroid. Okay, erase those arrows, and now we can see the inner lining of the eye. That would be the retina, and that's the nervous layer of the eye, which is composed of nerve cells or neurons, and they're continuous with the nerve cells or neurons that are in the optic nerve. All right, where the retina continues on into the optic nerve, that area is known as the optic disc. So that would be this little area right through here would be the optic disc, or also known as your blind spot, because there's no rods or cones, which are the photoreceptors. They're not located there because that's just where the retina connects with the optic nerve. Okay, of course, You know from your lecture that the chamber at the back of the eye, or the big cavity at the back of the eye, is called the posterior cavity. It's filled with a jelly-like fluid called the vitreous humor. And then the fluid that is in all of this area in the anterior cavity is filled with the aqueous humor, which is a watery fluid. Okay, so this is just a view of a section of the eye. If we look at the back of the eye more closely through the microscope, which is what's going to be on the next few slides, let me put a block around the area, or in this area that you see that I've got circled. All right, now we're going to look at that on a micrograph. So my next slide shows it. So here's the back of the eye. Let me place an arrow in the posterior cavity, all of this. This would be the vitreous humor. So the light waves come in through the vitreous humor, pass through the retina, and will then, or go to the last layer of the retina that you see right here, and that's where your photoreceptor cells are located. Okay, so we'll look at that more closely in just a minute. Right now, what I want you to do is be able to label these three layers at the back of the eye. All right, the outermost layer is the sclera, and if you look at that closely, you see fibers all running in one direction. That's the collagen fibers, the dense, regular, fibrous connective tissue. All right, then the dark layer is the very obvious choroid layer or choroid coat, and you can see the melanocytes there. And then the rest of this, it looks pretty striated here, but that's the retina, which is the pink layer. All right, if I drew a line across the entire retina, oops, I didn't do that. Sorry, just a minute. Let me get the line mode on here. All right, that would be the retina, okay? And then the second line is the choroid, and then this last would be the sclera. So make sure you know those three layers. All right, on the next slide, we're going to see this same slide, just a little bit more magnified. Here's on low power, and again, on this we see the sclera, the choroid, and then the retina. All right, the next slide is on high power. Here we see the sclera. Look at those collagenous fibers. That's about all you see in the sclera. And then the choroid coat, it's real obvious that you see the dark melanocytes. That's how you can recognize the choroid, because of all the darkness. And then the retina is actually very thick. The layer of the retina that hits right up next to the choroid is a little pigmented layer. But just next to that is a very significant layer. I'll put this in green. I'll put a line for it. This layer right there, that's where the photoreceptor layers would be. And so that in lecture, you're learning that the photoreceptors are actually the rods and the cones. So make sure you know that that layer that's highlighted in green, that's the layer of rods and cones. Okay, now you actually can pick out an individual rod and an individual cone. I'm going to put an arrow on what looks like little rounded, well, that one didn't go just right. Let me get it down a little bit. Little rounded area. Those would be cones. You see the cones? They're kind of thick. Okay, and there's several cones in here. And then in between the cones, you see some little skinny lines that don't stand out real well, but those would be the rods. And so they have long, skinny projections on them. For me, for your test or your quiz this week, you do not have to distinguish between a rod or a cone as far as what they look like, but you need to know that this layer is the layer of rods and cones. Okay? All right, now our last slide is still of the back of the eye, but it's a different slide, and it's turned a little bit differently. Can you find which layer is the sclera? It's this layer up at the top. It's just a little small section of the sclera. And then this thick dark area, that would be the choroid. And then the rest of this, which I'll put in green, all of that, well, it's in black, but that line I've drawn, all of that would be the various layers of the retina. And then I'm going to draw just some arrows right on the layer of rods and cones within the retina. So there you see it right there, the layer of rods and cones. Okay, so again, make sure you know the three layers at the back of the eye, the sclera, the choroid, and the retina. Make sure you can distinguish between them, and make sure within the retina you can find the layer of rods and cones. So I'll go back. I'm going to back to the fourth slide in this series. The first one just has the word eye on it, but then here's the lowest power micrograph that I've got in this little PowerPoint. Make sure on these you can find the sclera, the choroid, and the retina. So what would that be? Oops, I didn't put the line up. Here we go. You tell me, what would that be? See if you can identify that. If you said sclera, you're correct. What would that second line be? Choroid. And then this last would be the retina. Okay, on a higher view, again, we see the sclera, choroid, retina. And within the retina, this would be the layer of rods and cones right there. Okay, that should do it. Archive recording.